This is the screencast for units 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6, which covers several biogeochemical cycles. So we're doing this as one screencast because one thing that biogeochemical cycles have in common is that they're cycles, and that they make up nutrients that cycle through air, water, soil, rock, and living organisms. So we collectively call these cycles biogeochemical cycles. Bio for life, geo for the earth, and they are chemicals. We're going to look at three. We're going to look at carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So first up is carbon. And an important thing to notice about carbon cycle is that there's no real end or beginning, right? The carbon is continually moving through these different parts of the carbon cycle. And this is not the only carbon cycle diagram that exists. We're going to see others. But you see how carbon exists in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. It is taken out of the atmosphere by plants, which photosynthesize light and carbon dioxide and water into energy. Primary consumers can eat the plants, or the plants can die and turn into detritus. And then consumers will eat other consumers, or maybe detritivores will eat the detritus and give off carbon dioxide as part of their cellular respiration, and that puts carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. Another way that carbon dioxide can enter the atmosphere is through burning of wood or fossil fuels, which contain carbon. And notice how this is one part of the cycle that puts carbon into the cycle, but there's no taking carbon out of the atmosphere and going into fossil fuels, because we're not making fossil fuels fast enough right now to do that, or the earth isn't, I should say. So hopefully you know that carbon is the element of life, and that the concentration of carbon in living matter is greater than in the earth, right? So life has concentrated carbon to keep itself sustained. And so carbon has to be recycled for life to continue, because that's where all the carbon is. So in the abiotic environment, there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's dissolved in water in the oceans, and when it dissolves in water, it takes on the form of carbonic acid, HCO3 minus. So carbon enters the biotic world through photosynthesis, but then also through chemosynthesis. And as far as photosynthesis goes, you have to know the general inputs and outputs for photosynthesis, right? So light, carbon dioxide, and water turns into glucose and oxygen. You don't have to balance those equations, however. And then below you can see two different diagrams for photosynthetic and chemosynthetic food chains. So carbon returns to the atmosphere through cellular respiration, through burning, and decay. And for decay, it'll produce carbon dioxide if oxygen is present, but if it's an anoxic environment, then the decay will produce methane instead. So part of the issue that we're having right now, well, it's been going on for decades, but that the return of CO2 and its uptake are not in balance. So more CO2 is being put into the atmosphere than is being removed from the atmosphere. And so this is what's called the Keeling curve, where you plot the concentration of carbon dioxide over each year. And if you look at the overall trend in the last 70 years, you can see that carbon dioxide is going up, and not just by a little bit, by kind of a lot. Another cycle that we're going to look at is the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, of course, is a large percentage of the atmosphere, and it cycles through the biotic environment, starting with nitrogen fixation by bacteria, which changes N2 into NH3, which is ammonia. And then ammonification by bacteria can change it to NH4+. Nitrification by bacteria to NO2 minus, and then nitrification by bacteria to NO3 minus, denitrification by bacteria to N2. So you don't necessarily have to memorize those, but you've got to be able to understand them if you see a diagram that has the nitrogen cycle on it, the order in which these steps of converting nitrogen molecules or molecules that contain nitrogen, um, how that progresses. Nitrogen is a limiting factor in a lot of food webs. Um, we also add it to the environment through fertilizers, right, when we apply them to agricultural fields, and that can run off into the ocean. The phosphorus cycle is an interesting cycle in the sense that it doesn't have an atmospheric component. So most of the source of phosphorus in our environment comes from phosphate-rich rocks that are eroded. So it gets carried to gravel and silt and water bodies, um, and goes into silt and sediment. Um, but anywhere that there's soil, that's where phosphorus can be obtained by plants. And animals eat the plants and get the phosphorus. Animals die, decompose, it goes back into the soil. So it's possible for phosphorus to get to the soil from being eroded from mountains. The only way it comes back up after it's gone to the bottom of the ocean is through geological uplift. The phosphorus cycle is different from carbon and nitrogen in that it doesn't have an atmospheric component. Um, so phosphorus gets into the biotic world by plants absorbing it from soil. Animals eat the plants, or decomposers break down dead material and then return the phosphorus to the soil. Phosphorus can get leached into water bodies, and phosphorus that's eroded from mountains and so forth can also get into rivers and streams, which lead to the ocean, and any sediment that gets taken to the bottom of the ocean, eventually geological uplift will push that rock to the surface. But that takes, tens of millions of years for that to happen, if not hundreds of millions of years. So the phosphorus cycle is pretty slow. Any phosphorus that's currently available to plants and animals is really all that's supposed to be there. However, humans add phosphorus to the environment through agriculture by putting phosphorus in fertilizer, applying it to the fields, and then the extra phosphorus that is not used runs off into the ocean or the river. We'll talk about the sulfur cycle just a little bit, but it's not a major one, where there is atmospheric sulfur. It's a very small percentage. It can go into terrestrial ecosystems, can be part of precipitation, but it also runs off into oceans, and can get put back into the atmosphere through volcanic eruptions or decomposition. Well, that's it for units 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6. You should definitely be able to identify all the reservoirs, right, all the places in all of the cycles, as well as some of the processes that occur. So please let me know what questions you have about this information.